Walk into Harbor Freight today and something feels off. Your favorite angle grinder is 40% more expensive. The shelves are thinner. The deal that built this impossibly low prices is quietly falling apart. This isn't a sudden collapse, it's something slower and more dangerous. The unraveling of the one thing Harbor Freight was built on. This is the story of how a peddler's son built America's largest discount tool retailer. Why that empire is now cracking under debt, deception, and a trade war it can't survive. Harbor Freight Tools was founded in 1977 by Eric Schmidt, though the real story starts years before that, in the back of a van rolling through the San Fernando Valley. Eric Schmidt was born in Los Angeles to Alan Schmidt and Dorothy Schmidt. His mother had multiple sclerosis and his father, overwhelmed, and sent him to an orphanage when he was 9. 4 years later, he went to live with an aunt. Then, he moved into his own apartment at 16. By 17, he was already in business. That restlessness, the need to close a deal, never left. Eric co-founded Harbor Freight in 1977 alongside his father, Alan, starting a mail-order business where customers would call in to order tools from a catalog. It was humble, it was scrappy, and it worked. Early on, the business followed Alan's conservative approach, reinvesting all profits back into the company and avoiding debt. As Eric himself recalled, "We were doing great, and every penny we were making we put back into the business, not borrowing a dime from anybody. We lived like paupers until it was a $500 million business." That discipline built the foundation. Then, Eric dismantled it. The first retail location opened in 1980 in Lexington, Kentucky, to sell returned merchandise from the mail order business. It proved successful, and Harbor Freight began opening stores across the United States. The formula was simple and devastating to competitors. Harbor Freight sources its tools directly from the factories that build them, many of which it claims are the same ones that supply bigger retailers. This allowed the company to cut out intermediary stages of the supply cycle, providing greater savings for customers. Cut out the middleman, import directly from the factory, sell at prices no one else could match. It was a beautiful model, ruthlessly efficient. In 1985, Eric Schmidt became president of the company at age 25. His father was still chairman, but the power was shifting. By 1999, Eric bought out his father's stake entirely and became sole owner. Alan remained on the board. Eric promised his father nothing would change, that they would still run the company together, that Alan would have the final say on major decisions. That promise lasted about 1 year. What followed was a transformation that made Harbor Freight a retail empire, and a family war that exposed the darkest side of that transformation. When Eric took full control, he adopted a more aggressive financial strategy. Unlike his father, Eric believed in leveraging debt to fuel growth. He started borrowing money and using profits for both business expansion and personal acquisitions. Aggressive expansion. Hundreds of new stores, distribution centers across the country, near the Harbor Freight coupon mailer, landing in millions of American mailboxes every month. By the mid-2000s, the brand was everywhere, but so was the debt. In 2007, when Harbor Freight borrowed $500 million from Credit Suisse First Boston, Alan Schmidt accused his son of using some of the money as dividends to pay for a $46 million estate in Beverly Hills, a $100 million addition to his art collection, and a $20 million apartment in Manhattan. Then, the payments to his father stopped. According to the lawsuit, Eric Schmidt explained that he hadn't made the past 2 payments because the company was going through bad times. Alan's legal response was precise. Eric's looting of the company substantially contributed to any such bad times. In July 2010, Alan Schmidt, 81 years old, the man who started it all, sued his own son. The couple accused their son of looting the company. The lawsuit alleged fraud, breach of trust, undue influence, negligent misrepresentation, misappropriation of assets, breach of contract, and elder abuse. The lawsuit contended that Eric fired several longtime executives and kicked his father off the board of directors. Alan claims that in May, his son had the company's new chief operating officer walk him out of headquarters. The executive allegedly told him, "Don't come back." The case settled out of court. The terms were never disclosed. Eric kept the company. Alan walked away, and Harbor Freight kept growing, fueled by debt, cheap Chinese imports, and an increasingly aggressive marketing machine. The marketing machine, it turned out, had a problem. In 2015, no consumers filed a class action lawsuit claiming Harbor Freight engaged in deceptive pricing practices. They said the company falsely advertised regular prices for products that were higher than prices Harbor Freight described as sale prices, but the items had never been offered at those higher prices. This was the engine behind every red and yellow coupon, every compare at price, every "you saved $47" printed at the bottom of your receipt. By using fictitious anchors, Harbor Freight was accused of hijacking the consumer's decision-making process. When a miter saw is marked regularly $299, sale $149, the brain fixates on the $299. The $149 then feels like an incredible gain, even if the saw's true market value is closer to $130. The anchor is fake. The deal is an illusion. Harbor Freight denied wrongdoing, and the proposed settlement did not require Harbor Freight to admit fault. It covered any purchase from April 8, 2011 through December 15, 2016, where merchandise was advertised with a higher reference price that hadn't actually been charged for at least 28 of the preceding 90 days. Millions of customers had been making decisions based on a discount that was mathematically engineered, not real. It was not the last time Harbor Freight would settle without admitting it did anything wrong. Several customers also filed lawsuits related to a 2018 recall of more than 1 million chainsaws sold by Harbor Freight. The plaintiffs alleged the chainsaws had defective power switches that caused the blade to continue running until the user disconnected the power source. Plaintiffs said the company did not go far enough in making replacements available or notifying customers. Harbor Freight Tools was also sued by a group of store employees in 2012 who alleged they were misclassified as exempt managers under the Fair Labor Standards Act to avoid paying overtime. Since 2000, Harbor Freight has accumulated over $2.4 million in regulatory penalties across 17 recorded violations. A pattern was forming. Cut every corner that could be cut. Settle the lawsuits quietly. Keep the coupons coming. Keep the prices artificially anchored. And never, under any circumstances, stop expanding. By 2022, Harbor Freight was reporting revenues north of $5 billion. By 2024, estimated annual revenues reached approximately $8 billion, with a high single-digit revenue growth forecast projected to continue well into 2025. Over 1,600 stores, 30,000 employees, the largest discount tool retailer in the United States. Eric Schmidt had built something his father, however it ended between them, could never have imagined. A privately held empire. No quarterly earnings calls, no activist shareholders demanding answers, no public scrutiny of the balance sheet. Just a relentless machine printing revenue, opening new stores, and mailing out coupons to tens of millions of American households every single month. For a moment, it looked invincible. Then came Liberation Day. On April 2nd, 2025, the Trump administration announced the broadest set of tariffs in modern American history, sweeping levies on imports from dozens of countries, reciprocal trade taxes framed as economic nationalism, and for Harbor Freight Tools, the target that mattered most, the one that sat at the absolute center of its business model, was China. This was not a surprise. Tariff risk had been circling Harbor Freight for years. The first Trump administration had already imposed 25% duties on thousands of Chinese goods back in 2018. Harbor Freight had survived that round, adapted, absorbed some costs, passed others on, kept the coupons coming. But 2025 was different. The scale was different. The speed was different. And Harbor Freight's exposure was no longer manageable with minor adjustments. An estimated 60% of Harbor Freight's products originate from China. Not 10%, not 25%, 60%. Their pricing model, the entire reason the company exists, is directly and completely tied to the cost of importing those goods. When China becomes more expensive, says Harbor Freight gets squeezed from every direction simultaneously. This wasn't a supply chain inconvenience. This was an existential threat to the one thing Harbor Freight sold above everything else. Not tools, not quality, not service, cheapness. Raw, unambiguous, American cheapness. That was the product. That was always the product. And now it was under assault. Debtwire spoke to market participants, investors, advisors, restructuring professionals, scanning the landscape for companies most exposed to the new tariff regime. Harbor Freight Tools appeared prominently on the retailer watch list, alongside names like Michaels, QVC, and Wayfair, companies whose entire cost structure had been built on the assumption that Chinese manufacturing would remain accessible and affordable. In companies that were now staring into a wall of new costs with no clean path around it. The bond markets responded immediately. Harbor Freight's debt began to move. Creditors who had been comfortable started asking uncomfortable questions. And then came the rating agency verdict. Moody's changed its outlook on Harbor Freight from positive to negative, citing specifically the company's deep and structural reliance on imported goods. When Moody's moves on you, the entire financial ecosystem notices. Lenders tighten. Insurance on debt gets more expensive. The cost of refinancing rises. Every number on the balance sheet gets harder. The financial picture that emerged was alarming in its precision. And the company's debt-to-EBITDA ratio, the relationship between what Harbor Freight owes and what it actually earns, stood at approximately 3.8 times in early 2025. Already elevated. Already a number that demanded careful management. Projections from analysts indicated that ratio would rise to somewhere between 4.5 times and 5.5 times by mid-2026, driven almost entirely by the margin compression coming from tariffs. At the same time, interest coverage ratios, the measure of how comfortably a company can pay the interest on its debt from its operating earnings, declined from approximately 3.1 times down to a forecasted range of 2.0 to 2.7 times. Let that sink in for a moment. Harbor Freight is a company generating billions of dollars in revenue. And yet its cushion, the financial breathing room between what it earns and what it owes, is being cut nearly in half. Not because the stores are empty, not because people stopped buying tools, but because the cost of the goods flowing in from China is rising faster than Harbor Freight can respond. Those are not the numbers of a company in free fall, but they are the numbers of a company being slowly squeezed by forces it cannot control. The price increases came first. They always do. Before a company files anything, before the lawyers get involved, before the word restructuring appears in a single document, the prices move. Quietly, SKU by SKU, incrementally. Hoping nobody notices all at once, customers noticed. Popular Predator brand power stations jumped from $199 to $279, a 40% increase on a single product. An Icon branded work light that had sat at $99 was repriced to $119, seemingly overnight. Across thousands of individual products, the pattern repeated itself. A few dollars here, $20 there. Nothing dramatic enough to cause a single headline on its own. Everything dramatic enough to fundamentally change what Harbor Freight is. Because here's the thing about Harbor Freight's pricing model that most of its customers never fully understood. The discount was never really a discount. It was an anchor, a fictional reference point, placed next to a real price to manufacture the feeling of getting a deal. Courts ruled on this. Settlements were paid. And still the coupons came, because the psychology worked regardless. But now something worse is happening. No, the coupons that once applied a discount to a stable price are now applying a discount to a price that has already been inflated by tariff costs. The company is using the discount mechanism, the same one it was sued over, the same one built on manipulating consumer perception, to disguise price increases that would otherwise be impossible to explain to its core customer base. The Harbor Freight customer is not wealthy. That is the point. That has always been the point. The mechanic running his own shop on a tight margin. The construction worker who cannot afford Milwaukee but still needs a tool that works. The weekend DIYer stretching a paycheck. These are people for whom a $30 price increase on a power tool is a meaningful number. These are people who chose Harbor Freight precisely because they had no slack in the budget for anything else. When Harbor Freight raises prices, it is not just adjusting a margin. It is breaking the contract it made with the people who made it rich. The deeper problem is structural. And structural problems do not respond to short-term fixes. Harbor Freight cannot simply pivot away from China. The idea sounds reasonable until you look at the actual mechanics of it. Moving manufacturing to Vietnam or India or Mexico requires relationships that take years to build, tooling that must be retooled, quality control infrastructure that must be rebuilt from scratch in a new country with new workers and new supply chains. It requires capital, significant capital, at precisely the moment when Harbor Freight's access to cheap capital is becoming more expensive. And here's the cruelest part of that equation. No company with any financial discipline is going to commit hundreds of millions of dollars to a factory build-out in Vietnam when the tariff policy that is driving the decision could be reversed, paused, or renegotiated in 6 months. The uncertainty is not just a problem. The uncertainty is the problem. It paralyzes exactly the kind of long-term investment that would resolve it. Meanwhile, the debt load accumulated during Eric Schmidt's aggressive expansion era is still sitting on the balance sheet, patient, demanding. The $750 million refinancing through Credit Suisse that sparked the family lawsuit. The additional leverage taken on to fund hundreds of new store openings, distribution centers built across the country, all of it financed through debt that was manageable when the cost of goods was low and growing revenue covered the interest payments. That equation has changed. The company's default probability, a forward-looking market measure of the likelihood that a company fails to meet its debt obligations, had fallen as low as 0.225 in January 2025. That was the optimistic moment. Analysts thought Harbor Freight had turned a corner. Then Liberation Day hit, Moody's moved, and the default probability climbed back to 0.302 as conditions deteriorated through mid-2025. To be precise about what that number means, it is not imminent collapse. Harbor Freight is not filing for bankruptcy tomorrow. Its stores are still open. Its employees are still showing up. But 0.302 is a number that is moving in the wrong direction at the wrong speed for a company that has no clean strategic option to make it stop. The pressure is not coming from one direction. It is coming from all directions simultaneously. Tariff costs compressing margins from above. Debt service obligations compressing cash flow from below. Consumer price sensitivity, preventing Harbor Freight from simply passing all costs through. And a trade war with no predictable resolution date hanging over every decision the company needs to make about its future. Harbor Freight built its entire identity, its marketing, its expansion strategy, its customer loyalty, its reason for existing, on one singular promise. The lowest prices. Always. Not approximately, not usually. Always. But that promise is now in direct conflict with the economic reality of a trade war that Harbor Freight had no hand in starting and no power to stop. It is being squeezed by forces entirely outside its control, in a direction it cannot pivot away from quickly enough to escape the damage. The story of Harbor Freight is not finished. Not yet. The orange and black stores are still open. The parking lots are still full on Saturday mornings. The coupons are still arriving in mailboxes. The website is still showing compare at prices next to lower prices. And millions of Americans are still making the same calculation they have always made, that Harbor Freight is the best deal in the room. But look closer, and the picture is different. The prices are higher. The shelves are thinner on certain items. The debt load is heavier. The Moody's outlook is negative. The tariff exposure is enormous. The supply chain cannot be meaningfully restructured in time to prevent significant margin damage. And the company's core customer, the one who shops there because they have no other option, is the least able to absorb a price increase and the most likely to simply stop buying a $279 power station that used to cost $199. A family built on frugality and discipline, transformed by ambition and debt. A pricing strategy built on the psychology of illusion, sued and settled, and never fundamentally changed. A supply chain built almost entirely on the assumption that one country would always be cheap enough to make the model work. And now a tariff regime that tears that assumption apart. Eric Schmidt's father once stood in his son's office and was told that nothing would change, that they would build the company together, that the promises made between a father and a son were real and would be honored. They were not. Now, a different promise is under pressure. The one printed on every mailer that lands in your mailbox. The one behind every red percentage sticker plastered on every product in every store. The one that tens of millions of Americans have built their budgets around, their home repairs around, their livelihoods around. The promise that Harbor Freight will always be the cheapest option in the room. That promise kept this company alive through lawsuits, through a family war, through product recalls, through deceptive pricing settlements, through a 2012 debt crisis, and a 2022 slowdown and every other headwind that should have slowed it down but didn't.